I've noticed you don't use the term war on terror. I think I read an article that you've only used it once since inauguration. Is that conscious? Is there something about that term you find objectionable or not useful?
Well, I think it is very important for us to recognize that we have a battle or a war against some terrorist organizations, but that those organizations aren't representative of a broader Arab community, Muslim community.
I don't think Dick Cheney's going to like that answer. From my interview yesterday with President Obama, who doesn't like to use the term war on terror, Dick Cheney does. Tonight, 2 weeks after leaving office, the former vice president has unleashed a chilling warning for the country and the commander-in-chief. Cheney says there's a high probability that al-Qaeda will attempt a catastrophic attack against the U.S., one far greater than 9/11. He also defends Guantanamo Bay, domestic spying, waterboarding, just about everything else he sanctioned for the last 8 years. Tom Foreman has the interview right now.
Even in the bare-knuckled world of Washington, this was a remarkably sharp attack by the former vice president. The plan to close the prison camp at Guantanamo amid complaints about human rights, a clear sore point in his interview with Politico.com.
When we get people who are more concerned about the, let me think carefully how I describe this, but more concerned with reading the rights to an al-Qaeda terrorist than they are with protecting the United States against people who are absolutely committed to do everything they can to kill Americans, then I worry. Whether or not they can pull it off depends in part upon us and what kind of policies we put in place and whether or not we're prepared to do what we need to do.
On this day, even before President Obama took office, Cheney defended the treatment of terror suspects under President Bush, and now with Obama condemning torture and reversing many Bush policies, Cheney is insisting.
If it hadn't been for what we did with respect to terrorist surveillance program or enhanced interrogation techniques for high-value detainees and the Patriot Act and so forth, that we would have been attacked again.
Not only that, he says, time will prove it.
He says once the files are open, people will be able to see the Bush administration policies, policies that he's closely linked with, that those policies averted attacks.
Still, the attack Washington is buzzing about right now is this one. Top former officials rarely have such harsh words for a new president, and almost never so soon. But Dick Cheney made it clear long ago the opinions of others don't bother him much, and the Obama administration has not responded. Tom Foreman, CNN, Washington.
Let's dig deeper with national security analyst Peter Bergen and senior political analyst David Gergen, who joins us again. David, is this just bad form for this vice president to do this?
Well, by the way, Anderson, before we start, on your AC's 360 blog site tonight, the opinion's running 99-1, I would say, in favor of the president cracking down on executive pay. On Dick Cheney, and listen, it is unusual. Some will call it bad form. But I think Dick Cheney sees that, look, he's had some sharp elbows to the ribs here in the last couple of weeks from the Obama administration, who have been castigating the policy of the Bush administration. He almost sees this in Churchillian terms, that he's happy to be the lone voice taking all this criticism if he, in effect, saves the country from what he thinks is a terrible U-turn in American policy on Guantanamo and torture. He does think, bottom line, that those policies, condemn them if you will, have also spared us from an attack. So there's, at base here, you know, there's a lot of talk in Washington these days about the sharpness of attacks on both sides, but there are deep philosophical differences between these two parties. It's
interesting, though, Peter. I mean, some of the things that he says, I mean, he said at one point that people in the Obama administration, you know, feel that it's okay to just talk nice to terrorists and they'll go away. I mean, I don't think I know of anyone in the Obama administration who actually believes that. What do you make of his justifications of, you know, the terrorist surveillance program, enhanced interrogation techniques, as he called them, others would call them torture, waterboarding, among other things, the Patriot Act? Are these valid assertions that this kept America safe?
I think elements of the Patriot Act, for instance, bringing down the wall between law enforcement and intelligence gatherers was very useful. Setting up the National Counterterrorism Center, a recommendation of the 9/11 Commission, which is, after all, something the Bush administration fought for a year not to have. That's a place where there is fusion of all the different elements of government going after terrorists. But I think it's very much an open question whether coercive interrogation has made us safer. I mean, former Vice President Cheney is essentially saying, trust us. You know, whenever these files will be opened, you'll finally realize how you were kept safe. I'm naturally skeptical of those sorts of claims.
Is there also any figure on how many terrorists or potential terrorists were created by the war in Iraq?
That's an interesting question. I mean, a study that I did with a colleague at New York University, we found that after the Iraq War, for the first 3 years after the invasion, that the actual number of jihadist terrorist attacks around the world went up 7-fold. And even if you took away Iraq and Afghanistan from that equation, you still had a 33% rise. We weren't making the case that the Iraq War had caused all these terrorist attacks, but certainly it is the case that the Iraq War tended to create more terrorists.
David, I want to play just for our viewers another clip from this interview.
I think there's a challenge there for the Obama administration, whether or not they take the time to understand what we did and why we did it and how we did it before they run off and start taking down programs that I think are essential to the security of the nation.
It is fascinating hearing him. I mean, there is a certain level of arrogance that if somebody doesn't agree with him, it's that they're not smart or they don't understand the argument.
Yeah, there is, and I think this is exactly the point Peter was making. You know, when you're outside the national security net, you don't have access. And people on the inside say, well, basically, if you knew what I knew, you'd know how right I was. And, you know, there's no way you can argue, there's no way you can really argue with that. I do think that where I think the Vice President was unfair to President Obama was in essentially leveling the charge that he's closing down Guantanamo willy-nilly and not taking time to understand this. And in fact, what President Obama has done is said, we're going to close down Guantanamo, but we're going to take up to a year to figure out how to do this safely and protect ourselves from terrorism.
Well, he also says the thing about Guantanamo, that it's the hardcore people. It's the same thing that, you know, these last 200 are the hardcore. Frankly, that's what they said about, you know, the hundreds who were there before that, and many of them turned out to be not so hardcore. He also, Peter, uses figures on recidivism rate for Guantanamo. He says it's 11 or 12%. Secretary Gates last week, I think, put the figure at 4 to 5%. Whose numbers are accurate?
Well, I think the numbers that former Vice President Cheney is using is the number of 61 that have returned to the battlefield, which is a Department of Defense number. But when you actually pass those numbers, only 36 of them are suspected to have returned to the battlefield. Returning to the battlefield could be involved, meaning getting involved in propaganda activities against the United States rather than actual terrorism. I think the Department of Defense needs to do a better job of explaining who the people that they really determined who have returned to the battlefield, so we have better numbers. Right now, that 11% number, I think, is highly debatable. The number that I would be comfortable with would be more like 4 or 5%. But Anderson, you know, the news that that the Saudis have announced that 11 people who were in Guantanamo have gone through their re-education program, have now been released and gone to conduct terrorist activities in other countries potentially, I think is a problem for the Obama administration going forward on this issue, because it seems that the Saudi program, which was sort of the gold standard here, has been a little bit leaky, more leaky than the Saudis had initially said.
And that's certainly terrifying indeed. We're going to have to leave it there. Peter Bergen, David Bergen as well. Thanks very much. Next.